Nobody wants to be the reason that their company doesn't win a proposal. Hi, my name is Jordan Jones. With me is my colleague, Jesse Dottino. And today we're going to be walking through how to give a little bit better of a presentation when it comes to presenting RFPs. We've helped companies secure over $100 million in awarded funding, all through learning how to present a little bit more effectively. Today we're going to walk through some of the most common mistakes, and that's where I'm going to open it up. And Jesse, I want to talk to you about this. When it comes to working with companies, what is one of the most common things that you see a lot of people making mistakes with? What is that number one for you that you see?
I think especially when it comes to those high pressure RFPs where a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of people's energy is on the line, what we focus on is the content. Any presentation, of course we do. It's a very important part. But this is what I lovingly call the show up and throw up. We do our research. We put together all of our content, and then we get in front of whoever that panel looks like, whatever they're doing, and we're showing them how much work we put into it. We're focusing a little too much on the content instead of really taking the time to connect with that audience and think about how you're delivering those moments. And I think that that's where a lot of presentations fall flat. In terms of the companies that we've worked with, we've noticed that the biggest shift is actually taking the time to really dive in, really rehearse, and really find the story behind the how they got there, rather than all of the steps and why they got to that conclusion.
Absolutely. And one thing I always see with that is the show up and throw up. I love that. I love that saying because it's true. You show up, you've prepared, you have all this information ready. You're going to talk about it. You're like, I'm going to go this way. I'm going to go this way and talk about this point, and I'm going to nail it. I'm knocking it out of the park. But when it actually comes to present that presentation, a lot of people goes right out of their brain. They can't remember what is happening, what they're doing, what they're supposed to say. Again, it goes back to what we originally said. Nobody wants to be that reason they didn't get that, their company didn't get that proposal. And they have so much fear and anxiety, they don't want to mess up, that it almost makes them mess up by having that anxiety.
Yeah.
So getting over those nerves and really focusing on how you come off. And this is something we teach a lot in our workshops, based off a study done by a UCLA professor, Dr. Albert Moravian, where he looked at thousands of presenters and thousands of audience members within these presentations. And he asked them, what was it that made these presentations take off? And what he found were three distinct categories that made up what a presenter was conveying to the audience. And it has to do with your message.
Yeah, the words coming out of your mouth.
Your content, your body language, and your voice. And these make up what? Over 93% is just from your body language and voice, but the majority of people, they focus on showing up and just giving all their content instead of thinking about how am I coming off? How is my body language appearing? How does my audience perceive me? And how, I would say most importantly, do I want to be perceived? A lot of people want to come off as credible, they want to come off as knowledgeable, and they want to share all of their information. But in reality, that's not always the most important thing. It's kind of focusing on how am I coming off to my audience? Am I coming off clear and concise? Or am I just showing up and throwing it, right?
I think a big piece of this, especially when we're talking about RFPs, is that with whatever panel, whatever industry that you're in, if you do get a request for an RFP, you're going up against people who might have very similar content that you do, might have maybe the same answers that you do to solve their problem. But what that panel is really doing is actually determining whether they can trust you or not. Do I want to work with these people? Do I want to trust these people? And what is the biggest indicator that I don't want to work with someone is if I'm looking at someone and presenting, going through the content that they know that they're the expert at, and they look like they don't trust themselves. So how can we make that shift? So in those moments of high anxiety, high intensity, where there's a lot on the line, how can we ensure that that time is worth that panel's, or that moment is worth that panel's time? And that's the biggest piece of it. I'm not only buying the idea behind what is on this RFP, I'm also investing in you. Do I trust you? Do I trust your company? Does this group of people look like they want to work together and work together well? That's a big piece of it.
It is.
Yeah.
I agree. And how do you build that trust? Because people do business with people they trust. So if they don't trust you, they're never going to want to sign that agreement and say, yep, this is the company I want to move forward with. But how do you build that trust? It's not something a lot of people think about when it comes to communication. They think, well, I think naturally I'm trustworthy. But what are some of the things that you see that make people untrustworthy or come off and appear? They could be the most trustworthy person in the world, but they're coming off as untrustworthy based off of how they're presenting. What do you typically see in speakers that come off that way?
Well, I love that question because one of the things that we talk about a lot in our public speaking and presentation workshops is, as human beings, we sometimes say that we're judgy people. We judge people. I don't know that that's actually necessarily true. I actually think that what we're constantly doing is evaluating how safe we are with someone else. And that person is indicating to me how safe they are by what they're doing with their body language and how they're using their voice. And so much of it is not intended. Sometimes what can happen is when those nerves start kicking in, we will be communicating something that we do not intend. And so being hyper aware of how we're communicating, not with just our words, but through our voice and through our body language, that's what actually builds trust. And I think it's trust also matched with time. Because we talk about this all the time too. What is the one thing that everyone in the world is selfish about?
Their time.
Don't waste my time.
Don't waste my time.
Don't waste my time. And if you can walk away, especially in these RFP moments, this panel is listening to presentation after presentation after presentation, and they feel that when your group is finished, that their time was well spent. That's 90% of it right there, don't you think?
Absolutely.
Don't waste my time. And when we think about preparing for these kind of high intensity, big budget projects, a lot of what people are thinking about is just the content, not about how am I going to make my audience feel safe with me. And I think that has been the difference between that $0 get that your company gets versus that $100 million get. And we've seen it over and over again.
I agree. And one thing you said there was with voice. A lot of people don't pay attention to their voice. They also don't pay attention to their body language. And some of the most common mistakes you see is people, they show up, they're so ready for their content, but they're not paying attention to their nonverbal communication. And that's over 55% of your message comes from what people are seeing. They can tell your attitude, your feelings, all from just what you're doing with your nonverbal communication. Think of your eye contact, your hand gestures, your posture. But people aren't worried about that. They're worried about their content. And what happens is they say about 80% of the time when you're sitting there presenting, your brain is thinking about what am I going to say next. The majority of your brain's processing power is going into what am I going to say next. You're trying to articulate your thoughts, your ideas. You're not thinking about what your body language is doing or your voice. So what naturally happens is you hear people start going, and their eye contact's going all over the place. They have the ums and uhs everywhere, and it becomes very distracting. And do you trust somebody that has a ton of ums or uhs? Not really. They come off as incompetent, as if they don't know what they're talking about. And that's something that could detract that trust. Even though it could be the most trustworthy person in the world, they're not showing it with their body language and voice.
And you're bringing up a really great point, Jordan. A lot of what I think happens in these RFP proposals is we're given an allotted time for our slide deck, to go through the presentation. Well, maybe we nail that. Slide deck's clean, it's not overwhelming, I'm not competing with the slide deck with my content, trying to talk over too much information on that slide deck behind me. We nail that presentation. And then what happens next? Q&A session. And all of a sudden, all that confidence starts going out the window because we start looking for our information other places. And that's where I see 90% of people lose their credibility is when that Q&A session starts. How can we treat that Q&A session not as the end of the presentation, but really truly as the beginning of the next conversation? And I think what happens is that within that show up and throw up, we put way too much content on the top. Save some of that information for that Q&A. Keep it in your back pocket. What does my audience really need to hear? It's not about what I want to tell them. It's about what they need to hear. And I think that finding the presentation through that lens, A, helps people feel that their time is of value, of course, because we're not overwhelming them or front loading them with too much information. But B, it also keeps that conversation going at the end. Because that's really when you're getting to know who these people are. Your authenticity comes through, your sense of humor. You see how the group dynamics work together. And that is where people can really, really shine. And often we don't think about that Q&A session. We might think about what the questions maybe will come up, but we don't actually sit down and practice it and watch this team work together. That's where a massive piece of the buy-in comes in, I really feel.
Couldn't agree more. When you have that Q&A session, it really does open up that conversation. You now have the panel that can ask questions, but how do you handle that situation? Are you really thinking through it? Have you practiced some of the questions that you're probably going to get asked? Can you anticipate what those might be and practice them ahead of time? Mm-hmm. Or what do you do in a situation where you genuinely don't have the answer or you can't think of it like that?
Scary, right?
It's terrifying. It's one of the worst things in the world. Mm-hmm. But if you have a strategy, which we provide in our workshops on how to overcome those situations and make the most of them, rather than sitting in a interview or a proposal situation or presentation where you say, deer in the headlights, I don't know, and you're putting that filler word in and you're just losing your credibility because of how you are answering the question because you don't have an answer like that, where a lot of people don't unless they've prepared ahead of time for them. It becomes a very tricky situation to navigate, and you could make or break the deal right there. Even though you gave this great presentation, you could make or break it. And you brought up another great point that I think a lot of people don't think about. Maybe they do, but they don't think about it as a presenter, as maybe you or I would, and that's PowerPoints. And oftentimes, you had brought up when there's clear and concise, but how many times do we see PowerPoints and it's just a jumble? It's a wall of text, and we're sitting there trying to read it as the speaker's trying to speak it, and we're just saying, shh, be quiet. I'm trying to read here. I can read faster than you can speak. Or they read that script word for word to you, and you're like, I could read this. You don't need to read it to me.
My biggest pet peeve.
One of the biggest. I think everybody is. When somebody's reading right from the PowerPoint, it's awful. It's like, just if you want me to read it, I'll read it. If you don't want the audience to read it and you want to speak it, well, then don't put it up on the slide. And this is where going through a slide deck boot camp will really help your team deliver a presentation. I mean, you're an expert on it. You've helped people secure millions of dollars from just slide decks alone and having powerful presentations. What do you see typically when it comes to PowerPoints and errors that companies often make?
Way too much content on that slide, and they're not thinking about it from the audience perspective. And I think that unfortunately a lot of companies, and where I start off the first step of working through these slide decks, and boy oh boy, it can be a fight sometimes, I get it. Because we like to show our work. We feel like our credibility comes with how hard we work. But if we really think about it from the audience's point of view, a lot of times the information on that slide deck is not for them. It's for you. So thinking about that slide deck and really thinking about so what? Why does this one matter? Do I really, really need it? Oftentimes there's slide decks that we don't need. And all it's doing is competing with you as the presenter being the center of that presentation. And then B, what is the story of that slide deck? How am I telling the story of the journey that we are going to go on together? Because there's always a story in there somewhere. And that's really where the power of storytelling comes in, yes, within your content, but also within your slide deck. And if you can walk away from a presentation and be able to retell that story because that slide deck is supporting your content that are the words actually coming out of your mouth, if you can walk away and are able to retell the story of that presentation, guess what? That's an effective presentation. And that's what we're all about. How can I make this content as sticky as possible and my time spent with you as memorable as possible? And those are the two pieces that I think really can detract from that slide deck, because I'm looking at the slide deck more than I'm paying attention to you as the presenter, and we should never be competing with our decks.
Your PowerPoint is your side salad. It's the side dish. Don't get me wrong, I love the carbs, the mashed potatoes, but it is not the entire presentation. The main course is you, the presenter. You're the filet mignon, or if you're vegetarian, the portobello mushroom. That is the main piece of the presentation. It's not the PowerPoint. So don't rely heavily on the PowerPoint. Have the information down to a point where you can look at the slide, you know the main points, and you could riff just based off of what you're seeing. This takes a lot of time to practice and rehearse, but with someone like us or a team like us, we'll come in and really help dial your team in. And I think just investing in your team will help you secure more money in the future.
I think so too. And I think that one thing that I've noticed, especially with companies, teams, businesses that have brought us in and we've worked with them slowly, is not only do their presentations elevate and become more successful, but their camaraderie and their inter-team work grows that much more too. Because all of a sudden they're communicating on a much more, what's the word?
Collaborative level. You're forcing them to communicate and be in the same room, have that conversation together.
And honestly, that's the most rewarding piece of it all, because whether it's the byproduct of just having common language and a common goal, there is a deeper sense from everyone around them that this team is actually good. There's a deeper sense of
this team is cohesive. What Jessie is saying, what Jessie is trying to say, I can read her mind. She's saying this team is cohesive and they can work together. And do you want to work with a team that can work together well, or a team that's dysfunctional, unorganized, they don't have their stuff together? Because you can tell from the presentation they're giving whether it's a team you're going to want to work with for the next X amount of years, depending on the length of the proposal. Or not, all from just what you're seeing them and how they're presenting.
Absolutely, it's a feeling that room will have. It's an elevated moment that transcends, and you can't teach that. That has to just be natural, which I think is the coolest byproduct of the work that we do.
I couldn't agree more, because when you have us coming into your house, you're now forcing your team to work together. They're forced to present in front of each other, and it just builds a bond. It's something I think we all see within our workshops is after you've seen each other be very vulnerable up in front of a stage on recordings, you start to come together because people are sharing stories, and when you share stories, you start to build a bond. You can start to trust these people, and when you build trust, well, you start to like those people a little bit more. You understand where they're coming from, where they've been, and it just helps you overall understand that person just a little bit more. And this is something that everyone in the world can use. If you understand people a little bit more, well, chances are you're going to have a lot more respect for them and have a lot more understanding of where they come from. Before we wrap up here, Jessie, any final thoughts, any words you would like to share with the audience?
I think going back to the idea, just to reiterate one more time, that it has to be more than the content. The reason that people are successful with RFPs and the reason why panels tend to trust this group more than the other is not just the content. It's watching them work together. It's watching them connect with their audience, because they're not doing the presentations for themselves. They're doing it for their audience. It's about you. It's about the audience. It's not about us and our team. And that translates. That builds trust, and that is a valued time. And I think that was one of the biggest takeaways in terms of working with groups that have been very successful with RFPs, is you just feel it. You feel the difference, because they invested in themselves, they invested in their team, and they know what their story is.
So don't let your team fail. Bring us into your house. We will help your team improve their presentations and increase the probability that you will get that deal. Don't be afraid to invest in them. Don't be the reason your team doesn't get that job.
I got it. Excuse me, my nose is dripping.
Spicy.
Spicy. Are we cool, Danny?
You sounded good.
You sounded good.
Yeah.